Hello, my name is Rytis Beresnevičius and I'm a journalist at Airtime News. Today I'm speaking with John Grant, who is a senior analyst at AOG, and we're going to discuss the current status of the world's leading airport hubs. While all airports have suffered from the lack of connectivity, some were worse off than others. But what does the future look like for many of them? Let's find out. So, hey John, thank you for speaking to me. How are you on this fine winter evening?
Yeah, well, it's good. We're all in lockdown, and we're set to be here for another 3 months, I suspect. So we've just got to get used to it. But it's just part of the recovery process.
Yeah. So throughout the year, especially 2020, since March 2020, I feel like airports did not get the same recognition as airlines did, as in they were not as much in the headlines as airlines were. So from your own point of view, what has been the reality of airports and especially mega hubs throughout, the current crisis, essentially?
Well, it depends which end of the spectrum you're at, I think. For the very small regional airports throughout Europe, this has been a disastrous year.
Yeah.
They typically would have very few services, perhaps no more than one or two customers. And for many of them, they will have seen all of their commercial services being cancelled or suspended. Some of their airline customers may no longer be in business. And it's highlighted, perhaps as much as anything, the importance of airports who are quite small in scale, having diversified their revenues, not just from aeronautical services, which is what an airport is about, but about office space, MRO, hangars, commercial property, and finding other ways to be an economic centre rather than just an airport. So they have been particularly badly hit. And sadly, they've been ignored in many cases by regional governments who have no money and cannot support them and have other priorities. For the hub airports, it's a very different story because they are, in many cases, extensions of their base airline. So when we think about Dubai, we think about Emirates. When we think about Frankfurt, we think about Lufthansa. So it's no surprise in some regard that they have been caught up and considered as a secondary part of the news story. We think about how Emirates have tried to recover and how Frankfurt / Lufthansa have made many people redundant and organised their business. But some of those hub airports have also diversified. So some of them have suddenly, in the last nine months, seen many more cargo movements than they had seen in previous years. So they've been able to recover some of their revenues by replacing passenger services with cargo services. That's great, but cargo doesn't spend money in shops, and it moves very quickly, and it is quite cyclical. So in 5 years' time, that cargo market may not be there. We may be moving PPE and medical supplies by refrigerated containers and shipping and things like that. So it's very different. But certainly hub airports have been impacted as badly as the regional airports.
Yeah. Do you think that, like for airlines, we've had some airlines saying that, cargo essentially helped them better the crisis. Do you think for airports that's the same case, or for the airports it's more like, it's at least something that they can, bring in some cash by cargo?
I think it's for airports it's a much more marginal play over time than it is for the airlines. I mean, for the airlines, I heard stories in March and April and May of last year that the rates for cargo were 6 to 7 times higher than they normally are. Now, for an airline, that's a great piece of revenue, but for the airport, it's still the same landing fee, and it's still the same cargo fee. So it was a much more marginal contributor for airports. It was good profile, it was good revenue, it was using the infrastructure, but it was nowhere near as important as it was for airlines.
Okay. So if we backtrack a bit, there's no doubt that the air travel industry was blossoming essentially before 2020 hit. How were the largest hub airports? Were they healthy in terms of their structure, in terms of their financial status, or what was the case with them?
They were. Airports are very complex and expensive infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
We need to always think about an airport is something that is planned over maybe a 7 to a 15-year time period, whereas an airline has an asset, which is an aircraft that can be reallocated and moved to another airport or to another destination. But most of the hub airports were very well established. And were, as I said earlier, linked to what would happen with their national carriers. Many of them would see about 50 or 55% of their capacity being provided by those base airlines. And surrounding them would be a cluster of alliance members. So again, if you look at somewhere like Munich or Frankfurt, you would see that there would be lots of Star Alliance airlines who would also be flying and operating to that airport, as well as British Airways and Air France and KLM, for instance. So they were doing particularly well. Clearly, they were seeing passengers grow. The asset was being well utilised. So there was just the right number of gates and runways at most airports. So their businesses were doing quite nicely. And then COVID occurred.
Yeah, well, COVID hit everyone. But when I look at OAG data for capacity, when it compares to 2019 and 2020, I mean, there's a huge difference between how hard were airports hit in, for example, North America or Europe to Asia, and Asia in particular seems very, that they were hit very hard by the travel restrictions. Why do you think is that?
It's very simple. It's about whether you are an international to an international hub, or whether you have domestic capacity and domestic demand. And it's very clear if you think about the geography of Europe. Many of the hubs in Europe are facilitating international to international services. Now, they might be within the European Union, and we think of the European Union as a single market, but every country is its own borders and its own territories, and they all behave differently, and they stop flights and apply travel restrictions. And two of the largest hubs in Southeast Asia, Hong Kong and Singapore, there is no domestic market. So they purely relied on that. Whereas in North America, if you look at places such as Dallas, Fort Worth and Chicago and Atlanta, the international proportion of their business was actually relatively quite small. And there is no alternate, or there is no really competitive, viable alternate transport mode in North America than air service, because of the vast geographic distances, and the same in Russia. And in the recovery, what we've seen is one of the European airports that's done better than most is, and countries, is Turkey and Istanbul, because they have both domestic, a large domestic market, and also international services.
Do you think the crisis will force, airlines such as Cathay Pacific or Singapore Airlines, which are based, these international to international hubs, maybe to take a look at their businesses, or they don't have any other choice, to be honest?
Well, in the case of Cathay, they've done quite a bit already, because Cathay Dragon has now been absorbed back into Cathay Pacific. And there are other restructuring exercises going on around their ownerships and partners there. For Singapore Airlines, you're absolutely right. There isn't very much more you can do. I mean, you can resize your airline, and they're trying to do that. They have more A380s parked in the desert than that are likely never to return. So it's perhaps accelerated them thinking about their strategies. And going back to Cathay Pacific, they had embarked on, I think it was about 11 new international destinations that they were going to fly. And they've already said they will not be returning in the near future. So, in some ways, it's quite interesting that we're seeing airlines respond to what's happened, and they're going to have to change their networks.
Yeah. You mentioned there that Europe is, an interesting market because, everyone thinks of it as a single unit, but, there's many countries. And for example, one example that sticks to my mind is Austria, and that, with the aid package that they gave to Austrian Airlines, they said, well, basically short-haul routes within the country are replaced by trains. Do you think that trend, especially within Europe, will continue and it will emerge eventually and maybe even replace domestic flights within Europe?
Well, we've also seen that in France. The Air France package was predicated on more domestic train services and intermodal transfer between air and rail being facilitated more effectively. Look, it's a short-term soundbite. I think in Austria, part of it is because the ruling party are the Greens, and they wanted to make a point, and they have done so. But quite frankly, Austria trades with many countries in Europe where it is not possible to get to by train. It would be a very long car journey, and therefore flights to Greece and some European islands or to Spain will have to continue by flights. And it's a soundbite.
Okay. So another market that's really dependent on regional connectivity, I guess, is United States. We've, comparing the capacity numbers, once again, we've seen that the large hubs of the United States have lost a huge chunk of, connectivity there, especially with connecting seats. Yeah. Do you think there's an opportunity for airlines, maybe even Spirit, JetBlue, which are not necessarily familiar, I'm not familiar, but not associated with the mega hubs of like LAX or JFK, to maybe expand in those airports?
It's a difficult one, and it's a good question. We were already seeing Spirit, Allegiant, and Frontier expand quite rapidly in 2019 and the early part of 2020. And a lot of that was based around operating from secondary cities in the north of the United States to Florida and to places such as Fort Myers, Tampa, Orlando, and in the case of Frontier, I think, to Punta Gorda. So it was already happening. The challenge will be in the recovery, of course, that there is huge brand loyalty to the frequent flyer programs of the major airlines in the United States, and particularly for the corporate demand as and when that recovers. I think we also need to reflect upon the fact that many of the gates, they have a very different operating structure at the airports. The gates in many of the major airports are owned by the airline. So it gives them a degree of control in the airport that we don't see in Europe. But Spirit have ambitious plans. The other ultra low-cost carriers have ambitious plans, and it's whether they have the balance sheet that's going to allow them to move quickly in the recovery period. It will be an interesting watch.
Yeah. In the same vein, do you think the current crisis will force airlines maybe not to look back, but maybe take a deeper look into the point-to-point model? Maybe airlines will expand on that model and maybe rely less on their hubs and expand into maybe smaller, not necessarily regional airports?
Yeah, that's a really difficult strategic question to answer, because those point-to-point markets do not have the critical mass to support high-frequency services. And some of the interesting experiments we've seen in the United States where airlines have bypassed their hubs and operated non-stop services into Florida and into Phoenix and into Arizona. What they've done really is just provide almost a once weekly flight, maybe a twice weekly flight, because it's an experiment. And now is a great time to experiment because there's plenty of aircraft around and not much demand. But if people want connectivity and they want convenience, that they don't have to all get on a flight at 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 5 o'clock in the morning, then the hubs are the only way to facilitate that. Whether we see a change in the way they operate and are structured is another point, you know. So will we still be able to see these really intensive minimum connecting times of an hour and 30 minutes or even an hour for an international to an international flight with COVID protocols, screening, social distancing? That may not be possible. Will we see 5 or 6 waves a day? Perhaps we'll only see 3 or 4. But these things will just play out in the next 7 or 8 months.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, 6 or 7 months. In a recent capacity overview in your blog, you mentioned that 2021 will be a year of 2 halves. As more capacity returns to the market, and airlines maybe are seeing out where the market is. Mm-hmm. So what do you think 2021 will be in general in terms of recovery? Will we be anywhere near 2019 levels, or it's still quite far away?
No, I think if you assume we are where we are for the first quarter of this year, I mean, any airline that in the current environment adds a lot more capacity back, apart from Chinese New Year, has misread the tea leaves very, very badly. And that's not going to happen. So I think if you assume that is already baked in, the probability is we're not going to get above 75% of the capacity we saw in 2019 for the total of 2021. And even that will take a strong recovery. All of which is going to be predicated on vaccine distribution and the establishment of a common passport for travel. So it's going to be tough, but what we know in Europe and we've seen quite clearly is there is huge pent-up demand. People want to travel. We know low-cost airlines are really very, very clever at stimulating demand. With very strong, effective marketing and pricing. And we know certainly in many markets in the northern European arena that people are already booking for the summer. Because quite frankly, all of those factors, that those who are fortunate still to be working have built up quite a bit of cash. And there's this concept of revenge spending. So, I think we will, as soon as the doors are opened, rather like we saw in 2020, there will be a sudden rush of people who want to visit friends and family and relatives. And if that works and we don't have a spike 4 or 5 of COVID, then I think people will be let out and will be traveling again.
Yeah. Do you think that summer 2021 will be essentially a tipping point that we'll see, how well the aviation will, weather the crisis, whether, airlines can build up enough resources in terms of cash to continue weather the storm if it does continue?
Well, I mean, they're building up. The danger, of course, now is that, this drive for bookings for the summer is partly instigated by the need to cover cash for the next 3 or 4 months. So that's already underway, and airlines are acutely aware that they need to build this cash up and prove that they can have a valid operation into the summer. I hope it is the tipping point. It's not going to be a quick recovery. Last year, the sort of prognosis was that it would take until 2024 before we saw anything like the levels of capacity and demand we saw previously. That may stretch out to 2025. It is the sensitivity of when we get impacted by this is when we hit a COVID spike to the impact to a year's demand is quite fragile. And now to have another COVID spike in Europe and in other parts of the world, when the airlines need the cash, and when people are thinking about booking, it creates a little bit of uncertainty that we could do without.
Yeah. From your own point of view as an analyst, how hard is it to predict, the near-term future, in terms of demand, in terms of what's happening in the sector, essentially?
Well, it's not hard if you're prepared to change your forecast every day. but it's, you know, it's impossible. And I think it is, as an experiment and as someone looking at the data, you know, it has been the most fascinating period to see how markets have changed and responded, and it sort of has brought us back to remember, to just thinking about some of the key factors about travel and particular markets. So I don't see that it's going to get any easier in the next 12 months. What I do know is that if you haven't got the data, you've got no chance of understanding what's going on. And I also know that, you know, airlines are under intense pressure, having to change their schedules nearly on a daily basis. So the market has never been so sensitive to external factors as it is today.
Yeah. So in general, what's your opinion on the short and long-term recovery of, you know, the largest airport hubs? Are they gonna, you know, be as important as they were, or is their importance going down, like when we compare them to maybe smaller regional airports?
Everyone has a role. You know, those regional airports that provide that connectivity to an economic centre and access from somewhere like Aarhus to the world are very important. But they have to work in partnership with the hub airports. And, you know, what we had previous to COVID was a fairly efficient structure that combined those regional markets and those hub airports. We're going to clearly see smaller aircraft types, and those mega carriers will, I think, stop operating the A380 as soon as they possibly can. I mean, clearly for Emirates, it's a big issue. The 747-400 variant has nearly disappeared. The 800 never really gained momentum. And they had too many business class seats. So, you know, I can see airports, the mega hub airports, for instance, could be in a position where effectively their traffic volume slows down for the next couple of years, but the average number of flights per annum probably remains broadly similar, because they'll be using slightly smaller aircraft types. So we'll see more 350s, we'll see more 787 type operations. You know, it's been really interested in the recovery to see that those airlines who are flying long haul have in most cases been using their most modern fleets of 787s and A350s, because they're a better size to the demand, and of course they're cheaper to operate.
Yeah, good. I want to ask you one final thing before you know, we say our goodbyes. From your own point of view, how do you think business travel will look like in the future? You know, can Zoom, you know, Microsoft Teams, and these other platforms essentially replace face-to-face connection, or, you know, it's just a temporary thing?
Well, it's worked, and it's working to date, which is great. But you know, I think, and it might have been a bit of tongue in cheek, but when Ed Bastian at Delta made the comment, you know, the first time someone loses a piece of business because a competing sales exec met the customer face to face, then the other companies will start traveling. And I think they will. I think they will not travel with such intensity and such frequency, though. I think it's a combination of what is a perceived risk that probably will not be a perceived risk, but it's also about the cost of travel. And, you know, I've heard of some major US companies that have saved millions of dollars by not traveling in the last 9 months, but not seeing their business significantly impacted. So I think we'll see less, but it will come back. But, you know, the first segments that are going to come back are visit friends and relatives, leisure travel. In the leisure travel, if the vaccine is widely distributed, then where we previously thought it was going to be Generation X and Zs who were young and were not exposed or cared about the virus, I wouldn't be surprised if we see silver surfers who suddenly decide they're going to make that bucket list trip to South America, Australia, Asia, wherever it happens to be, coming back out.
Great. Thank you, John, for your time.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for speaking
Have a good
to me.
day.